Anna Wells had never been the kind of person who sought out conflict, nor was she the type to let people walk all over her. At 56, she had long outgrown the need to prove herself to anyone. Her life was structured, predictable, and deeply personal. After spending decades working as a structural engineer, Anna had taken early retirement following the unexpected passing of her husband, Michael. Losing him had left a void so profound that, for a while, she had felt unmoored, as though she were drifting through life without direction. It wasn't until she turned her focus toward their home, a modest yet beautiful property in a quiet suburban neighborhood, that she found a sense of purpose again. Michael had always loved the house, and together they had poured their hearts into maintaining it. But it was the garden that became her sanctuary. What had once been a simple backyard with neatly trimmed hedges and a modest lawn transformed over the years into a lush, vibrant escape. Anna cultivated rare plants, arranged pathways lined with flowering shrubs, and installed a koi pond that reflected the golden hues of the evening sky. The work was meticulous, requiring patience and dedication, but that was exactly what she needed. Every morning she would wake up early, brew a cup of coffee, and step outside to immerse herself in the quiet solitude of nature. It was in those moments, kneeling in the dirt, pruning, watering, or simply watching the wind rustle the leaves, that she felt closest to Michael. It was the only place where grief didn't feel like a weight pressing against her chest. The neighborhood itself had changed over the years. When she and Michael first moved in, it had been a peaceful, tight-knit community where neighbors exchanged greetings over fences and borrowed cups of sugar without hesitation. But things shifted as new residents moved in, people who saw the homes not as places to build a life, but as investments, as properties to be leveraged for profit. Some were pleasant enough, others indifferent, and a few, like Karen Thompson, were insufferable. Karen had moved in 5 years ago and made her presence known immediately. She was the kind of person who always had something to complain about. If a car was parked too close to her driveway, she'd knock on doors demanding it be moved. If a tree branch extended even an inch over her property line, she'd threaten to call the city to have it removed. She carried herself with an air of self-importance, as though she had been appointed the unofficial mayor of the street. Despite her outward friendliness, the forced smile, the exaggerated cheer in her voice, it was clear that Karen enjoyed exerting control over those around her. And for the most part, people tolerated her. Anna had kept her distance, choosing to remain cordial but not overly friendly. She had no interest in small talk over the fence or in listening to Karen's endless grievances about the neighborhood. But there had always been an unspoken tension between them, an underlying friction that neither of them addressed directly. It was there in the way Karen eyed Anna's property whenever she walked past, in the way she made offhanded comments about people taking up more space than they need, and in the not-so-subtle hints she dropped about how some residents weren't community-minded enough. For a long time, these were nothing more than minor annoyances, background noise in an otherwise peaceful existence. That changed on a crisp autumn morning when Anna stepped outside and immediately knew something was wrong. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from the night's rainfall, but her usual sense of morning serenity was absent. Something was off. It took her a moment to realize what it was. The boundary markers, the old metal stakes that had been in place since the house was first built, were gone. She walked toward the edge of her property, frowning as she took in the sight. The markers had always been there, partially buried beneath layers of soil and grass, but unmistakable. Now the space where they had stood was smooth, as though someone had deliberately removed them. Her chest tightened with unease. This wasn't a natural occurrence. No storm or strong wind could have pulled those markers from the ground. Someone had taken them. Her first instinct was to scan the neighboring properties, and that was when she saw it. Karen was in her backyard, standing near the fence that separated their properties. Only the fence had been moved. It was subtle, just a few feet deeper into Anna's land, but to someone who had spent years memorizing every inch of her garden, the difference was glaringly obvious. Karen had claimed a portion of her property as her own. Anna's blood ran cold. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. She took a steadying breath and walked toward the fence, stopping just short of stepping onto Karen's side. Karen, dressed in a floral-patterned blouse that stretched tightly across her frame, turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. She smiled, as though this were just another casual morning, as though she hadn't just stolen part of Anna's land. "Oh, good morning, Anna," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Anna didn't return the pleasantries. "Karen," she said, her tone measured, "I notice my property markers are missing." Karen tilted her head in mock confusion, her expression a carefully curated mix of innocence and mild amusement. "Oh? I hadn't noticed. But, I always thought this section was actually part of my yard. The old fence must have been in the wrong spot all along." Anna's jaw tightened. "That's not true, and you know it. The markers have been in the same place for decades." Karen let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Well, I suppose that's a matter of perspective. But don't worry, I had some contractors come in and fix it. They agreed this was the natural boundary line." Rage simmered beneath Anna's skin, but she kept her voice level. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just decide to move the fence." Karen's smile didn't waver. If anything, it grew more condescending. "Well, if you feel that strongly about it, you're welcome to check the records. But honestly, Anna, what's a few feet? It's not like you were using it for anything important." Anna could feel the pulse in her temples. This wasn't about the land, it was about power, about control. Karen was testing her, pushing to see how far she could go before Anna pushed back. And as much as she wanted to lash out, to demand that Karen put the fence back immediately, she knew that wouldn't work. Karen thrived on conflict. She enjoyed watching people get frustrated, watching them squirm. No, if Anna wanted to win this, she had to be smart. She had to play the long game. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward her house, her mind already racing through the steps she needed to take. She would pull the original property records. She would get an official survey. She would consult a lawyer if necessary. Karen had made a mistake. She had underestimated Anna. Anna sat in her study, her fingers gripping the edges of an old manila folder that contained the original property records for her house. The papers were yellowed with age, but the information was clear. Her lot had been measured and recorded decades ago, and the boundaries had remained unchanged since the day she and Michael had moved in. Every detail was documented, from the precise square footage to the placement of the original markers. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Karen had stolen her land. The thought sent another wave of anger rolling through her, but she forced herself to stay composed. This was not the time to act on emotion. Karen was the kind of person who thrived on conflict, the type who could twist an argument until her opponent was too frustrated to fight back. No, this had to be handled methodically, with facts and official documentation. Anna had spent years working in engineering, navigating bureaucracy, and dealing with stubborn clients. She knew how to get things done the right way. She made a list of her next steps, writing each one with deliberate precision. First, she would contact a surveyor to conduct an official measurement of the land. Then she would go to the county records office and obtain an updated plat map. If necessary, she would consult a real estate attorney to ensure Karen couldn't use some obscure legal loophole to keep what she had taken. She wouldn't let herself be caught off guard. By mid-morning, she had already scheduled an appointment with a local surveyor. The man on the phone had sounded polite but busy, assuring her that he could come by in a few days. It wasn't as soon as she would have liked, but it was a start. In the meantime, she decided to visit the county records office in person. If there were any discrepancies in the paperwork, she wanted to know about them as soon as possible. The office was a dull, windowless building in the center of town, filled with rows of metal filing cabinets and the lingering scent of paper and toner. The woman behind the counter barely looked up as Anna explained what she needed, tapping at her keyboard with practiced indifference. Property records for Wells, Anna. Address, Before she could finish, the woman waved a hand dismissively. "I just need the address." Anna recited it, then waited as the woman scrolled through the database. Several minutes passed in silence, and just as Anna was about to ask if there was a problem, the woman frowned and leaned closer to the screen. "That's strange," she murmured. Anna's stomach tightened. "What is?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned the screen slightly so Anna could see for herself. The record displayed her property information, but there was something off. The lot dimensions were different from what she had at home. The eastern boundary, the side that Karen had encroached upon, had been altered. It showed that her property was smaller than what had been originally recorded. "That's impossible," Anna said, her voice sharper than she intended. The woman gave a tired shrug. "All I know is what's in the system." Anna inhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "Is there a record of when this change was made?" The woman clicked through a few screens, then nodded. "Looks like it was updated a few months ago." A few months ago. Long before Karen had moved the fence, before Anna had even suspected anything was wrong. That meant this wasn't an impulsive act, it had been planned. Who authorized the change? The woman glanced up. "I can't give out that information without a formal request." Anna clenched her jaw. "Of course. Bureaucracy. Then I'd like to file one." She spent the next 20 minutes filling out forms, requesting a full record of any modifications made to her property's official documentation. It would take days, possibly weeks, to process, but at least the wheels were in motion. As she left the building, a realization settled over her like a weight. Karen had been preparing for this. The missing markers, the moved fence, the way she had so casually dismissed Anna's concerns, it had all been deliberate. But how? How had she managed to alter official property records without anyone noticing? By the time Anna returned home, her frustration had transformed into something colder, more determined. She didn't bother going inside. Instead, she marched straight to Karen's backyard, where the woman was lounging in a patio chair, sipping iced tea as though she hadn't just committed an act of blatant theft. Karen glanced up as Anna approached, her expression shifting from feigned innocence to mild amusement. "Well, hello again," she said, setting her glass down. "Back to discuss our little boundary issue?" Anna folded her arms, keeping her voice measured. "I went to the records office today." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Did you now?" Anna watched her closely. If Karen was surprised, she hid it well. "The records were altered," Anna continued. "A few months ago." "Funny timing, don't you think?" Karen let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. "Oh, Anna, you're really working yourself up over nothing. Maybe you just misremembered the original boundaries. I have the original records, and I've already requested an audit to find out exactly who made those changes." For the first time, Karen's expression flickered just for a second. It was subtle, but it was there. A tightening around her mouth, a slight narrowing of her eyes. Then, just as quickly, she laughed. "Well, that sounds like a lot of trouble for something so minor," she said, shaking her head. "Honestly, I was just trying to clean things up a bit, make things more orderly." Anna stared at her, feeling something close to disbelief. The sheer audacity of the woman was staggering. "You had no right," she said firmly. Karen smiled, slow and smug. "We'll see. It was a challenge, plain and simple." Anna turned without another word, her mind already working through the next steps. Karen thought she could get away with this, that Anna would get frustrated and give up, that she could push and push until there was no fight left in her. She was wrong. By the time Anna stepped inside, her hands were steady, her pulse even. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and began compiling every document she had. The next few weeks would be a battle, but if Karen wanted a fight, she would get one, and Anna had no intention of losing. Anna spent the next 2 days gathering everything she needed. She combed through her personal records, searching for any receipts, permits or documents that could reinforce her claim. She printed out every piece of official paperwork she had obtained from the county records office, highlighting the inconsistencies that had appeared in the system. She even went so far as to retrieve old neighborhood photographs, some from her own albums, some from local archives that clearly depicted the original boundary markers standing exactly where she remembered them. Each piece of evidence fit together like a puzzle, forming a picture so clear that even the most skeptical observer couldn't deny what had happened. But information alone wasn't enough. Karen had already manipulated the system once, altering official records without anyone noticing. That meant she had influence somewhere, a connection or an advantage that Anna hadn't yet uncovered. If she wanted to fight this properly, she needed to understand exactly what she was up against. The first real breakthrough came from a place she hadn't expected: the local surveyor she had initially hired. His name was Mark Townsend, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of weary expression that came from dealing with one too many property disputes. When he arrived, he set up his equipment with quiet efficiency, taking measurements while Anna stood by, watching intently. "I'll be honest," Mark said after a while, peering down at his equipment. "This is strange." Anna's stomach tightened. Strange how? He adjusted the settings on his device, frowning slightly. "I've worked in this area for over 20 years, and I know for a fact that these lots were mapped out decades ago. The boundaries have always been solid, no ambiguities, no overlapping claims. But based on what I'm seeing here, someone altered the data in the registry. And they didn't do a particularly clean job of it." Anna's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Mark tapped a few buttons, pulling up the GPS data he had collected. "When someone officially changes property lines, there's a process. A request gets filed, paperwork gets reviewed, and surveyors, people like me, get called in to confirm the new dimensions. But there's no record of a formal adjustment here. It looks like someone manually edited the registry without going through the proper channels." The confirmation of her suspicions sent a fresh wave of anger through Anna, but she kept her voice steady. "So, it's illegal?" "Oh, definitely," Mark said. "If this was done without due process, it's fraud. Whoever did this bypassed the system entirely." Anna exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had assumed Karen was simply manipulative, using personal connections or loopholes to get what she wanted. But this was bigger than she had anticipated. If records were altered without oversight, then that meant someone inside the system had either looked the other way or actively helped her. Mark packed up his equipment, handing Anna a printed copy of the survey results. "I'd suggest bringing this to the county office as soon as possible. If they see a conflict between the registered data and an independent survey, they'll have to investigate." Anna took the papers with a nod. "Thank you, Mark." But even as she said the words, she knew this wouldn't be as simple as presenting evidence and waiting for justice to prevail. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. That was proven the very next morning. Anna woke to the sound of voices outside her house, low, murmuring tones that sent an immediate sense of unease crawling up her spine. She pulled on a sweater and stepped onto her porch, her stomach sinking at the sight before her. Karen stood near the fence, her arms crossed over her chest, flanked by two men in work uniforms. Behind them, a truck was parked along the curb, the logo of a landscaping company emblazoned on the side. Anna descended the porch steps, walking toward them with controlled, measured steps. "What's going on?" Karen turned, her expression one of exaggerated surprise. "Oh, good morning, Anna. I was just about to knock." Anna ignored the pleasantries. "What is this?" Karen gestured toward the workers. "I've hired some professionals to do a little work on the property. We're putting in a new irrigation system and extending the landscaping, to make better use of the space." Anna's gaze flicked to the men standing behind her, noting the shovels and measuring tools they carried. They weren't just there to plant flowers, they were preparing for a major excavation. "This isn't your land," Anna said, her voice even but firm. "You have no right to do anything here." Karen sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Anna, I know you're upset about the property lines, but this has already been settled. You saw the updated records yourself. Anna tightened her grip on the papers she still held from the surveyor. Those records were falsified, and I have proof. Karen's smile faltered for the briefest moment, but she recovered quickly, her tone growing sharper. Then I suggest you take it up with the county office. In the meantime, I have every right to improve my property, and that's exactly what I'm doing. The workers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. One of them, a man in his 40s with a sun-weathered face, glanced between the two women before clearing his throat. Mom, he said, addressing Karen, if there's a legal dispute, we might need to. Karen turned to him with an icy glare. You're being paid to do a job. Do it. The man looked unconvinced, but he didn't argue further. Anna, however, wasn't about to stand there and let this happen. She stepped forward, planting herself directly in their path. If you break ground on this land, I'll have every one of you charged with trespassing and destruction of property. One of the workers muttered something under his breath, and the other shot a questioning glance at Karen. The tension stretched unbearably long, the air thick with unspoken threats. Then, finally, Karen let out a sharp exhale and plastered on another saccharine smile. Well, she said, I wouldn't want to cause a scene. She turned back to the workers. Fine. Hold off for now. The men exchanged relieved glances before retreating to their truck. Karen lingered a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so only Anna could hear. You're making this harder than it needs to be, she murmured. Anna met her gaze head-on. So are you. Karen smirked but said nothing more. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Anna standing there, heart pounding, fingers clenched around the survey documents. This wasn't over. Karen had tested her resolve, pushing to see if she would cave under pressure. Anna had held her ground, but she knew this was just the beginning. If Karen was willing to manipulate official records, hire workers to stake her claim, and outright dismiss legal threats, then she wasn't going to stop unless she was forced to. Anna had always been patient, always been methodical. But she was done waiting. It was time to escalate. Anna had never been one to let problems fester. She had spent decades solving complex engineering issues, navigating the bureaucracy of city planning, and dealing with stubborn contractors who thought they could take shortcuts without anyone noticing. She knew how to be patient, how to move pieces on a board without rushing, but Karen had underestimated one crucial fact: Anna never played a game unless she intended to win. The events of the last few days had only solidified her resolve. Karen had been bold, too bold. Moving the fence had been a blatant act of aggression, but the stunt with the landscaping crew had confirmed something far more concerning. Karen wasn't just testing boundaries, but she was securing her position, acting as though victory was already hers. That meant she had an ace up her sleeve, something she was confident would hold up under scrutiny. The falsified records had given Anna her first real clue, but now she needed to understand how deep the corruption ran. Her first call was to her attorney. She had debated whether legal action was premature, but after the surveyor confirmed the boundary manipulation, there was no point in waiting. When David Calloway answered, his voice was calm, collected, exactly what she needed. I was expecting your call, he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. Let me guess your neighbor escalated. She tried to start digging on my property, Anna said flatly. Brought in a landscaping crew like she already won. David sighed. That's not a good sign. That means she either knows she has leverage or thinks she does. I need to know how she got those records changed. The surveyor confirmed they were altered outside of normal procedure. That's fraud, right? In most cases, yes, David said. But here's the problem: unless we can prove intentional misconduct by a specific individual, it'll be chalked up to an administrative error. A mistake that will take months, maybe years, to correct if we go through the standard appeals process. Anna gritted her teeth. That was exactly what Karen wanted. What about an injunction? She asked, David hesitated. That's an option, but it's a gamble. Injunctions require immediate harm, and courts don't always see property disputes as urgent unless construction is actively damaging your land. We can try, but it's not guaranteed. Anna exhaled slowly, pressing the phone tighter against her ear. Then I need to force a response another way. David chuckled. I figured you'd say that. What's your plan? Anna had already been thinking about her next move. If the legal system was slow, she had to apply pressure elsewhere. She needed allies, people who had seen Karen's tactics before, people who might be able to provide information she couldn't access through official channels. She started by reaching out to her neighbors, the ones who had lived in the area long enough to know Karen's history. Most were hesitant at first, unwilling to get involved in what they saw as a personal dispute, but after some coaxing, the truth started to emerge. Karen had pulled similar stunts before, not just with fences but with complaints, code violations, and zoning loopholes. She had a pattern of pushing boundaries, sometimes literally, until people got tired of fighting her. One name kept coming up: Margaret Holloway. Margaret had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years before suddenly selling her home and moving out of state. The timing was suspicious, aligning almost perfectly with Karen's arrival. When Anna managed to track down her phone number, she wasn't sure what to expect, but when Margaret answered, there was no hesitation in her voice. I was wondering when someone would call me about that woman, Margaret said, a sharp edge to her words. You had problems with her? Anna asked. She made my life hell, Margaret said. She did the same thing to me, claimed part of my property was actually hers. At first, it was little things. She'd move planters, tell me I was misremembering where the boundary was. Then one day, I wake up and my fence is gone, just gone. Anna felt a chill run down her spine. I tried to fight it, Margaret continued. I went to the county, hired a lawyer. But every time I made progress, something would slow it down. Records would get lost, hearings would be postponed. I spent thousands, and in the end, I was just too tired to keep fighting. So you sold your house, Anna said. I didn't have a choice, Margaret said bitterly, and she got exactly what she wanted. Anna's grip tightened around her phone. Do you think she had help? Margaret let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't think. I know. There's a guy in zoning, Barry Franklin. He's been in that office for years, and somehow, every time Karen needed a correction in the records, it went through him. Anna wrote the name down, already forming a plan. Her next step was back at the county office, but this time she wasn't just requesting records, she was looking for Barry Franklin. When she arrived, she spotted him immediately. He was in his late 50s, balding, with a permanent frown etched into his features. He barely looked up as she approached his desk. I need to ask about a property boundary adjustment that was made a few months ago, she said, keeping her voice even. Barry sighed, clearly unimpressed. If you have an issue, you'll need to submit a formal. I already did, Anna interrupted. But I have reason to believe the adjustment was fraudulent. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. That got his attention. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, a brief flash of something nervousness, maybe before he schooled his expression into practiced indifference. I don't know what you're insinuating, he said. Anna smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I spoke to Margaret Holloway. Barry's fingers twitched slightly against the desk. I know how this works, Anna continued. Karen picks a target, paperwork goes missing, and suddenly, the records change. I have an independent survey proving my boundary was altered illegally. I also have an attorney who's more than willing to subpoena every case you've handled in the last 10 years to look for patterns. So why don't we skip the part where you pretend not to know anything? Barry's jaw tightened. This could go two ways, Anna said. You can cooperate, tell me how she got those records changed, and maybe this stays an internal issue. Or you stonewall me, and I make it very, very public. There was a long silence. Then, finally, Barry exhaled through his nose and muttered, Jesus Christ. Anna waited. Barry rubbed a hand over his face, then leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Look, I don't know everything, okay? I just processed what came through. But Karen, she's got connections. People in real estate, people who know how to work the system. She gets people to owe her favors, and when she needs something, she cashes them in. Anna absorbed that carefully. Who signed off on my boundary change? Barry hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled up the file and turned the screen toward her. The name listed wasn't his. It was someone higher up, and that changed everything. Anna had been prepared for a fight, but now she realized she wasn't just up against Karen, she was up against an entire network. And she was going to tear it apart. Anna had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated just how deep the corruption ran. The moment she left the county office with Barry Franklin's reluctant confession echoing in her ears, she knew she had stepped into something much bigger than a petty land dispute. Karen wasn't just a manipulative neighbor exploiting technicalities, she was backed by people who knew how to bend the system in ways that were difficult, if not impossible, to trace. That meant Anna had to move quickly and carefully, making sure every step she took was calculated, every piece of information she uncovered was properly documented, and every move she made was defensible in court. She wasn't just fighting for her property anymore, she was exposing something far more insidious. Her first call was to David Calloway. The attorney listened intently as she explained what she had learned, his usual composed demeanor shifting as he processed the implications. When she mentioned that Barry Franklin had directly named someone higher up in the zoning office as the person who had signed off on her fraudulent boundary change, there was a long pause before he spoke. "This is worse than I thought," David finally said. If a senior official was involved, that means it wasn't just a favor. It was an orchestrated effort. "Which means Karen isn't acting alone," Anna replied. "She's a piece of something bigger." David exhaled sharply. "Okay, we have enough to file for an official investigation, but I need to warn you, this is going to get ugly. People who operate at this level don't like being exposed, and they'll push back hard. You're playing with fire now." Anna tightened her grip on her phone. "I don't care. I'm not letting this go." "I didn't think you would," David said, his voice carrying a note of grim approval. "I'll start drafting the paperwork for an injunction. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. Don't confront Karen directly again, at least not without witnesses. If she feels cornered, she might do something reckless." Anna agreed and hung up, but the warning lingered in her mind. Karen had already shown how far she was willing to go, moving fences, hiring workers to reinforce her claim, manipulating records. If she realized Anna was closing in on the source of her influence, she would double down. The next move Karen made would be dangerous, and Anna had to be ready for it. She didn't have to wait long. 2 nights later, just past midnight, Anna was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground outside. It wasn't the sharp crack of a falling branch or the muted rustle of an animal moving through the yard. This was deliberate, forceful. She sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the flashlight she kept on her nightstand. As she moved toward the window, she hesitated, instincts screaming at her not to make herself visible. Instead, she turned off her bedside lamp and carefully parted the curtains just enough to get a view of the backyard. At first, she saw nothing. The garden looked as it always did, moonlight casting long shadows across the carefully tended rows of plants. But then, movement. A dark figure near the fence, someone crouching. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out details, but she could tell the person was large, bulky. A man. He was working quickly, his hands moving along the base of the fence. No, not just the fence. The ground. Burying something. A rush of cold fear shot through her, but she forced herself to stay still. If she ran outside now, she had no idea what she'd be walking into. Instead, she grabbed her phone, turned off the flashlight to avoid drawing attention, and snapped several photos through the gap in the curtain. Then, moving as silently as she could, she slipped out of her bedroom and into the hallway. She didn't turn on any lights as she made her way to the back door, but she unlocked it, just in case she needed to move quickly. The man outside finished what he was doing and straightened. Anna's heart pounded as she caught a brief glimpse of his face when he turned toward the streetlight near Karen's driveway. He wasn't anyone she recognized, but his presence confirmed something chilling. Karen had brought in outside help. She waited until the figure disappeared around the side of Karen's house before stepping outside, her flashlight now in hand, finger hovering over the switch. Her gut told her she shouldn't be out here alone in the dark, but she needed to see what he had been doing. The moment she reached the fence, she spotted it. A freshly dug patch of earth near the posts. The soil was uneven, hurriedly packed down. Anna knelt and hesitated only a second before digging with her hands, heart hammering against her ribs. Within moments, her fingers hit something solid, a plastic bag. Swallowing back unease, she pulled it out and carefully untied the knot. When she peeled back the layers, a foul, metallic scent hit her nose. Inside were rusted nails, shards of broken glass, and what looked like rotting meat. It was meant for the soil, for her garden, a deliberate act of sabotage. A wave of nausea rolled through her. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. Karen, or whoever was backing her, was escalating to outright destruction. If she had planted this and let it sit, her soil would have been contaminated, potentially poisoning the roots of her carefully cultivated plants. It was malicious in a way that sent a chill through her bones. Anna stood slowly, her hands tightening into fists. This was an attack, and she wasn't going to let it go unanswered. The next morning, she didn't call David first. She called the police. The officer who arrived was young, polite, but non-committal as he examined the bag Anna had dug up. He took a few notes, nodded sympathetically, and assured her that he would look into it. But Anna had dealt with bureaucracy long enough to recognize the tone. There would be no immediate action unless she forced their hand. Sure enough, when she pressed about filing an official report, the officer hesitated. "We'd have to prove intent," he said carefully. "If you don't have video evidence of someone placing this here, it could be difficult to establish a direct link." Anna clenched her jaw. "I have photos of a man on my property at midnight, digging. You think he was gardening?" The officer exhaled. "I can file an incident report, but without further evidence, I can't promise an investigation." It wasn't enough. She knew it wouldn't be. As soon as the officer left, Anna made another call to a private security consultant. If the police weren't going to act fast, she would take matters into her own hands. By that evening, she had security cameras installed around her property, motion-activated lights positioned near the fence, and an alert system synced directly to her phone. Karen had escalated the fight. Anna was going to end it. And by the time she was finished, Karen would regret ever thinking she could win. Anna had always believed in structure, in order, in the simple principle that the system, though flawed, was meant to function when you applied pressure in the right places. But standing in her backyard, staring at the fresh footprints left in the damp soil near the fence, she realized that order was an illusion. This wasn't about laws or property lines anymore. It was about control. Karen had spent months maneuvering, pulling strings, twisting rules, and now, when faced with a challenge she hadn't expected, she had resorted to sabotage. Poisoning the soil wasn't just petty revenge, it was a statement. A final push to break Anna down, to force her to either surrender or waste years trying to rebuild what had been destroyed. Anna wasn't going to let that happen. She spent the day preparing. She knew Karen wasn't finished, not yet. The pattern was clear. Whenever she was cornered, she escalated, but now Anna was ready. The security system was armed, her attorney was filing the paperwork to officially contest the fraudulent boundary change, and she had an appointment with a local investigative firm to review her evidence. If Karen wanted to play this game, then Anna would drag her into a fight she couldn't win. She didn't sleep. She sat in her study, reviewing everything she had collected: the surveyor's report, the falsified records, the footage from her cameras. When the alert on her phone chimed, she was already moving before she fully registered what was happening. The security feed showed movement near the fence. Karen wasn't alone this time. A second figure, taller, broader, was crouched beside her, flashlight in hand. Anna's stomach tightened as she recognized the man from the other night, the one who had buried the poisoned soil. Karen was speaking to him, gesturing toward Anna's property, and then she did something Anna hadn't expected. She handed him something. A hammer. Anna's pulse spiked. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing her phone, she hit record, then dialed 911 as she moved swiftly toward the back door. The dispatcher's voice came through as she stepped outside, the cool night air sharp against her skin. "What's your emergency?" "There are intruders on my property," Anna said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "One of them is armed." She kept her distance, lingering near the side of the house where she remained out of direct sight but could still watch as the man, whoever he was, raised the hammer and began prying at the remaining fence posts. Karen stood beside him, arms crossed, watching. They weren't just trying to intimidate her anymore. They were dismantling physical evidence. Anna's grip tightened on her phone. "I need officers dispatched immediately. I have them on video destroying my property." The dispatcher's tone sharpened. "Stay where you are. Officers are en route." But Anna wasn't the type to wait. Stepping forward, she turned on the floodlights. The yard was instantly bathed in harsh white light, and Karen spun around, momentarily blinded. The man with the hammer froze. "Step away from the fence," Anna said, her voice like steel. Karen recovered quickly, narrowing her eyes as she smoothed a hand over her blouse, as if this were nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Anna dear, this really isn't necessary. We're just making some adjustments." Anna lifted her phone, letting the red recording indicator glow like a warning. "Trespassing. Property damage. Destruction of evidence. You want to explain that to the police, or should I?" The man beside Karen stiffened. He wasn't just some hired worker, he was something else, something worse. His face was hard, expression unreadable, but there was tension in his stance, the kind of readiness that made Anna's instincts scream at her to be careful. Karen, however, simply sighed, shaking her head. "You're making this far more dramatic than it needs to be." Anna took a step closer, refusing to look away. "I don't think you understand, Karen. You're finished. I have the fraudulent records, I have the surveyor's report, and now I have you on video committing a crime. Whatever power you thought you had, it's gone." Karen's expression flickered, a crack in the composed facade. For the first time, real anger shone through. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Anna let out a short laugh, low and humorless. "Neither do you." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night. The man with the hammer cursed under his breath and took a step back, glancing toward Karen as if waiting for direction. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Then she did something truly desperate. She lunged forward. Anna didn't move, didn't flinch, as Karen stormed toward her, hands clenched into fists as if she intended to physically intimidate her into submission. But before she could close the distance, the first patrol car screeched to a stop in front of the house. The flashing blue and red lights cast jagged shadows across the yard. The man with the hammer bolted. Karen stopped in her tracks. Two officers emerged, hands resting near their holsters but not yet reaching for their weapons. One of them, a tall woman with a no-nonsense expression, took in the scene in a single sweeping glance before locking eyes with Anna. "You the one who called it in?" Anna nodded. "They were trespassing. I have video proof of them destroying my fence." Karen, regaining her composure, immediately shifted tactics. "This is ridiculous," she said, turning toward the officers with a dramatic wave of her hand. "This is a private matter, nothing that requires police intervention." The officer didn't look impressed. Property damage and trespassing are criminal offenses." She turned back to Anna. You willing to sign a formal complaint? Yes, Anna said without hesitation. Karen's jaw clenched, her face flushing red as she took a slow breath through her nose. This is a mistake. The officer didn't so much as blink. Then you can explain that downtown. Anna watched, a cold sense of satisfaction settling in her chest, as Karen was placed in cuffs. The other officer took her to the patrol car, murmuring instructions as she tried unsuccessfully to protest. As she was being led away, she turned once, eyes locking with Anna's, and for the first time, there was no smugness, no arrogance, only fury. Anna met her gaze with quiet certainty. She had won. The silence that settled over Anna's property after Karen was taken away felt almost unnatural, like the air itself had shifted. It was as if the house, the land, even the trees had been holding their breath, waiting for the moment when the relentless battle would finally end. But Anna knew better than to think that one arrest would make everything disappear overnight. Winning the fight didn't mean the war was over, it meant now she had to make sure Karen stayed gone. The next morning, Anna sat at her kitchen table, a fresh cup of coffee cooling beside her as she went through the official documents David had sent over. The formal complaint had already been processed, and Karen was facing multiple charges: trespassing, property damage, and falsification of official records. The last one was the most damning, and it was what would ensure that this wasn't just a slap on the wrist. David had called earlier, walking her through what would happen next. Karen had posted bail within hours, which wasn't surprising, but her legal troubles were only beginning. The county had launched an internal investigation into the fraudulent boundary changes, and since her name was directly tied to them, the repercussions were unavoidable. Barry Franklin, the zoning official who had helped facilitate the scheme, had already been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. And without protection from the inside, Karen's case was unraveling quickly. It was poetic, in a way. She had spent so much time pulling strings, manipulating the system, making sure everything was in place to take what she wanted, only to be undone by her own arrogance. Anna glanced out the window, her gaze lingering on the now empty space where Karen's illegally moved fence had once stood. The workers had come early in the morning to restore the original boundary, this time under the county's orders rather than Karen's. It had been satisfying to watch them dismantle the structure, piece by piece undoing everything Karen had tried to steal. The land was hers again, just as it always had been. The final legal steps would take time, but David was confident that Karen wouldn't be staying in the neighborhood much longer. Between the criminal charges and the lawsuits stacking up against her, she would either be forced to sell her home to cover her legal expenses or leave to avoid further humiliation. Either way, Anna wouldn't have to deal with her again. Still, there was one last thing that needed to be done. By midday, she found herself standing at Margaret Holloway's front porch, the phone call they'd shared a few days earlier still fresh in her mind. The older woman had been cautious, skeptical that anything could truly be done, but when Anna had told her that Karen had been arrested, there had been a long pause before she'd finally said, "Well, I never thought I'd see the day." Margaret opened the door, taking one look at Anna's expression before stepping aside to let her in. "I take it you didn't come all this way just for a social call," Margaret said as she led Anna to the small sitting room at the back of the house. Anna shook her head. "I wanted to tell you in person. It's over." Margaret let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since Anna had met her. "You're sure?" Anna nodded. "She's facing charges she won't be able to wiggle out of. Even if she tries to appeal, the fraud investigation alone will bury her in legal fees. She'll leave. She won't have a choice." Margaret was silent for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. "You did what none of us could." Anna exhaled, the weight on her chest finally beginning to lift. She counted on people being too tired to fight, but I wasn't willing to lose. Margaret nodded, raising her glass of iced tea slightly in a silent toast to not losing. Anna smiled and returned the gesture. By the time she returned home, the neighborhood felt different, lighter. As she pulled into her driveway, she saw two of her neighbors standing on the sidewalk, talking in low voices. They glanced toward her house, then back at each other before one of them, Danielle, from 3 houses down, lifted a hand in a small wave. Anna hesitated, then stepped out of her car. Danielle shifted, looking almost embarrassed. "We just wanted to say, we saw what happened last night, and we're glad you stood up to her." Anna tilted her head. "You knew what she was doing." Danielle exchanged a glance with the other neighbor, an older man named Robert. "Everyone did," Robert admitted. We didn't know what to do. She made things difficult for anyone who got in her way." "She did the same thing to me," Danielle added. "Not with property lines, but she tried to report me for a zoning violation that didn't exist. I fought it, but it cost me more than I could afford." Anna exhaled, realization settling over her. Karen had been a problem for years. It wasn't just her, wasn't just Margaret. Karen had built her little empire of intimidation across the entire neighborhood. And no one had stopped her because she made it too exhausting, too expensive, too risky. Until now. "You don't have to worry about her anymore," Anna said simply. Danielle smiled. "We know." That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, Anna slept soundly. There were no restless thoughts, no racing mind trying to anticipate Karen's next move. There was only peace. In the morning, she took her coffee out to the garden, breathing in the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. The koi pond reflected the soft light of the early sun, the water undisturbed still. It was quiet. It was hers, and no one would ever take it from her again.